Welcome to a video of the ICDD PhD Toolbox. My name is Stefan Soring. I'm Professor of Supply Chain Management at the University of Kassel. And today we will take a look at the use of theory in literature reviews and we'll try to understand how we can apply theory in literature reviews. We need some terminology up front. And that's what I'm briefly trying to introduce. So we have 4 different approaches, which you see listed here. I'll at the moment just center on the inductive-deductive divide, which you may have heard on in other classes already. So it's basically, do you develop knowledge, do you develop theory out of the material that you have, or do you rather have existing concepts and constructs that you work with and try to see how are they used, how are they applied, and how do we can we make sense of this? I will use some research that comes from our own, and part of this was even conducted inside the ICDD. 2 of my former PhD students, which you here see also among the authors, were part of this, and that's also why it and how it relates to the work overall. Looking at some terminology, that's what you see on this slide. We have a definition of theory, and that's what we basically need as an upfront understanding for developing this. And we have 4 elements that you typically see in theory. The first one is, what kind of definitions do you have? So you need to specify the variables, the constructs, however you call it. Then you need to look at, what is my domain? Where can I apply a theory? What can I explain with this? Can I explain supply chains? Can I explain, as the term is in the political sciences, global production networks? Or can I explain something in sociology or somewhere else? And we have to be aware that not every theory is applicable just about everywhere. Inside the theory, then we have concepts or relationship models. So we take the variables and look at how do they relate to each other. How does the one variable influence the other variable? So quite often we want to look at causalities. We want to really see on what's going on. And last but not least, and that's the 4th point here, theory should allow us to predict. We want to understand, on the one hand side, what happens in the past, what happened in the past, but we also want to look at the future, and we want to see on how can we use the theory for explaining, understanding on things that might happen and should happen in the future accordingly. Yeah, I pointed to this inductive-deductive divide already. This is quite relevant here, and we will see that it applies, and I'll try to explain this further in the next couple of slides. Right on this slide, you see that we define also literature review. What do we do in a literature review? We collect a certain body of literature, and then we try to analyze it in a reproducible manner, and we try to understand what's in there. So we look at what are the patterns, what are the themes and the issues, what are the concepts, and how can we use this for theory development. Let me here put in a word of caution. What I point to here is a literature review as a standalone piece of research. If you go for this, be aware that you might quickly invest a whole year of time just for the literature review, and it has to be checked on whether this is what you want to have. I'm not talking about what you would typically find in an empirical paper, which is just a literature review section where you sum up a certain status of the field in a narrow manner, so to prepare then your empirical research. That's a note of caution which you need to be aware of before you would invest your time into such an effort. Now going into it, what do you typically start with? You have keywords. Keywords is sounds quite simple, but quite often it's a bit of a trial and error that you have when you turn to certain databases. You heard about certain databases for searching literature already in other videos. So you might use Web of Science, you might use Scopus, but you might also use the databases that we have from other publishers. And then you would perform the search, and quite often you have to see on how much data you get. As a practical hint, I would say if you find below 50 papers on a topic, then it's usually hardly worth a review, because 10 papers anybody can read in a couple of few days, so it does not make sense. On the other end, if you go beyond, let's say, somewhere around 200, then quite often you go so much into detail that you can hardly understand it anymore and you can hardly sum it up. Then you might rather have to turn to bibliometric measures and bibliometric methods, which is a different set, which I'm not covering over here. For the data analysis, we typically rely on what is called content analysis. On the slide you will see an outline of the 4 steps of content analysis. I covered the keywords already, which is basically the material and the collection where you get your data. Then you have the descriptive analysis. I'll show you an example. Descriptive analysis is, for example, over which years are the papers published, in which journals are the papers published. Then we have the critical step of the category selection. Here the already mentioned inductive, deductive or abductive approach would come in, and then we come to material evaluation on how do you make sense of the data and how do you use the data, and that is also what I will illustrate with some brief examples where I show you at least some basic ideas on what we did there accordingly. Here's basically a process model. It's taken from a classical textbook on content analysis in German, but you would easily find similar process models and similar outlines also in the English literature without too much effort. If you look at the process model, that you see that you start theory-driven. It's here outlined a bit more on the deductive side, but else it could also be used in the same way in the inductive side, where you then would rather define your definitions inside the material while working with the data and then going through the data, analyzing the material and doing it. Let me also mention that typically for any kind of content analysis and coding, by now you would use software. A typical software package would be MaxUDA, but internationally it could also be NVivo and other software packages. They are not too different, but they help you to handle the amount of data and to make sense of it and organize it in a sound manner.